嗨，大家好，欢迎来到花花说的频道。今天我们来分享的是印度专家马凯硕教授说的越南欠中国一句道歉，反映了东南亚国家普遍采取这种既抗衡又交往的策略，这是不对的做法。正如马凯硕教授警告的，亚洲国家若在中国被西方围堵时集体沉默，可能最终导致西方收割整个亚洲。那么这到底是怎么回事？请看前方发来的报道。
You, in your famous recent session in New York, you alluded to how the Vietnamese see China. You know, anybody that wants to be the leader of China, Vietnam, you got to be able to stand up to China, but you also got to be able to deal with it. Is that the kind of attitude that the other Southeast Asians ought to be with, or it's just peculiar with Vietnam?
Well, I think you're referring to my session with Orville Schell of the Asia Society in New York, which, as you indicated, seems to have traveled well around the world.
Yes.
I would say some aspects of the China-Vietnam relationship can also apply to other Southeast Asians. And certainly we in Southeast Asia must be able to stand up to China, because China will become our biggest neighbors. But we must also be able to get along with China. But at the same time, what is unique about the China-Vietnam relationship, which doesn't apply to the other 9 Southeast Asian states,
right,
is that the other 9 Southeast Asian states have an Indic cultural base. Vietnam is the only one that has a Sinic cultural base. So there's a kind of intimacy between Vietnam and China that is very deep and goes back thousands of years, because Vietnam is the only state in Southeast Asia that's occupied by China for 1,000 years. And at the same time, the Vietnamese and Chinese have a very complicated relationship. And I'll tell you one story which I told at Columbia University. You know, way back in the 1980s, when ASEAN and Vietnam were still fighting over Cambodia, I gave a speech at Columbia University. In what surprised me was that in the front row were some Vietnamese diplomats at a time when Singapore and Vietnam were quarreling with each other. So I said, Vietnam and China have been fighting wars for 2,000 years. And I said, it's not surprising that sometimes the Vietnamese armies defeat the invading Chinese armies. So in 1979, the Vietnamese army fought well against the Chinese army. But in the past, whenever a Vietnamese army defeated an invading Chinese army, the first thing the Vietnamese emperor would do would be to send tribute to Beijing and say, I'm very sorry that I defeated your army. Please accept my apologies. And I say in 1979, Vietnam forgot to send the apologies. And you know what? The 3 Vietnamese diplomats went like this. So, you know, there are some, at the end of the day, ancient relationships, especially in Asia. Another example is China and Japan, right? And fortunately, you know, Ezra Vogel points out in his book on China and Japan have had the longest recorded bilateral diplomatic history, you know. So these 2 countries know each other very well. And for the past 1,500 years, they lived at peace for 1,450 years. So it's important, therefore, for us in Asia to nudge China and Japan back to the 1,450 peaceful year relationship, rather than trying to push them towards an antagonistic relationship. Because this is where we in Asia, certainly in Southeast Asia, we are too passive. We don't proactively go out and make a difference. And by the way, you know, that's why, frankly, one of the things I have done is to launch the Asian Peace Program at the Asia Research Institute of the National University of Singapore. Because it is puzzling in our world that even though peace is so important, we spend so much more time and resources on wars and almost nothing on peace.
视频看完了，马凯硕教授的观点非常具有启发性。他敏锐地指出，亚洲的关键战略游戏是经济发展，而非军事结盟。所以 RCEP 区域全面经济伙伴关系协定为例，指出一个以中国为中心的庞大经济生态系统正在亚洲形成，这将是决定性的地缘政治博弈的最终因素。他警告亚洲国家，在中国遭遇西方围堵时的集体沉默是短视的，是在帮助西方最终收割自己。亚洲的兴衰是一体的，团结才能带来持久的繁荣和稳定。他倡导亚洲国家更加主动地为和平投入资源和智慧，而不是被动地卷入冲突或对抗的漩涡。这也是他发起亚洲和平计划的初衷。所以既抗衡又交往是东南亚国家面对中国时的普遍策略，但越南因其独特的历史、文化、政治和地缘条件，将这一策略的复杂性和内在张力演绎得最为极致。所以教授指出，这是不对的，大家应该和平一起搞经济。对于越南或其他有志于在地区发挥领导作用的东南亚国家而言，其成功的关键在于能否在有效维护自身主权和核心利益的同时，最大化的从以中国的经济合作中获益友好的交往，并且能娴熟地在各大国之间以及东盟框架内进行纵横捭阖，避免成为任何一方的附庸或前沿阵地。这无疑是一场高难度的外交平衡术。马凯硕教授的论述提醒我们，亚洲的未来最终取决于经济融合、务实主义和和平共处的智慧，而非军事对抗的零和游戏。深厚的交织的历史既可能成为负担，也可能转化为共同理解的源泉。这需要各国展现出非凡的政治智慧和战略远见。谢谢大家观看，喜欢请点赞、评论加订阅。拜拜。